Welcome to the Your Life, Your Brand podcast with myself, James Oliver. Please hit the follow or subscribe button. It would mean the absolute world to me.
On this episode, I am joined by Michael Solomon. As a professor of marketing and an industry consultant, Michael combines cutting-edge academic theory with actionable real-world strategies on building brand and boosting customer engagement. So, let's dive right in. Michael, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I think the logical place for us to start is to go back to the beginning. How did you get into marketing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and for me, it was represented a very interesting career choice that was actually driven by the market. Because when I came out of graduate school, I had a PhD in psychology, but there were no academic jobs in psychology at the time. One of my professors said, "Why don't you look into marketing, because you study people and you study." I had been doing my dissertation on the psychology of fashion and how clothing affects the way we feel about ourselves, such as our professional clothing. At the time, I said, "Well, what does that mean? Does that mean going to the grocery store and buying food?" I didn't even know that marketing was a discipline. But I looked into it and managed to indeed get a job at New York University in the business school, and haven't looked back. So my psychology training has really benefited me, because I've been able to look at consumer behavior in a certain way and apply some of the general principles that we know about behavior to the marketplace, and they usually transfer quite well. So it's been a very good fit, I think.
So obviously, looking back on your career, I know you've taught at some leading universities around the globe. But after that, you moved into consultancy for kind of major brands. What themes did you see between these brands trying to understand their customers?
Yeah, well, I've always been a faculty member. I've always been a consultant. I started. I think my first major client back in the 1980s was Levi Strauss, looking at the psychology of blue jeans. And what I realized is that there's a lot going on with everyday purchases. You know, we tend to think about the really important ones, buying a new car, buying a new home, choosing a new career, etc. But the reality is that there's a lot of extraordinary stuff that goes on in our ordinary lives, just in terms of the products, the brands that we choose to express who we are, that we use to express who we are to other people. And so, one of the main insights that has come out of this, working with these companies, is the need to really understand that your brand means something perhaps quite different to the customer than it does to you. And if you don't understand what you're selling from the customer's perspective rather than from management's perspective, you're probably going to be setting yourself up for failure.
So practicing what you preach is obviously a massive thing for you when you go into the consulting world. And I guess for me is that you're driven on a human-centric, kind of customer-centric branding. So what kind of things within the trends have you seen in kind of these big brands?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest trend, if you will, over the last decade or 20 years has been the advent of what we often call Internet 2.0. In other words, the two-sided nature of today's internet, where companies are talking to customers, but customers now have the ability to talk back to companies, and more importantly, to talk to one another. So, the biggest thing that brands need to understand is, as I often say in keynote speeches, you don't own your brand anymore. You're a co-owner of your brand, but your customers help to define the meaning of your brand, and that happens over time. So sometimes you need to abandon your kind of rarefied perspective on your brand that you get from sitting in your office in London or New York or wherever you are, and try to understand the lived experience of the brand. In other words, how are everyday people who are actually using what you sell, how are they using that in their daily lives? And is there a disconnect between what you think is going on and what they think is going on?
For me, I couldn't agree more. And when I'm working with my clients, I'm explaining to try and always see things through the eyes of a customer. So many people are kind of so in their business that they don't realize what's actually going on outside of it, or kind of the feedback they're getting from their customers, especially as you get higher and higher up the management structure. Whereas I think it should be completely reversed, where ultimately the management teams should know their products inside and out, how they're being used, as if they were the consumer, alongside also their competitors' products.
Exactly. And although, everything you said makes perfect sense, it always surprises me how many organizations ignore that very good advice that you've given. And what they do is they violate the basic marketing concept. I tell my students on the first day of class, which is that we start with the customer and work backwards. In other words, we don't just invent new products because we can, and then try to figure out who might be a good market for them. Ideally, we start by identifying an unmet need that we have the capability to address, and then we can develop a marketing plan based on that. But too often, companies, and I've worked with many very large companies that frankly ought to know better, they adopt what one company actually called a molecule forward approach, which means that we invent molecules in the laboratory, new kinds of chemicals and so on. Then we say, well, I wonder if anybody will buy this. And that is exactly the wrong way to look, I think, at marketing and consumer behavior.
So before our interview, I was taking a look at your book, The New Chameleons, and I have to completely agree with your sentiment that customers are rejecting the labels a brand is trying to put on them. So what advice would you give to a business on how to connect with their customers?
Well, one thing I talk about in the book that's probably a bit difficult to swallow is I'm kind of arguing against traditional approaches to market segmentation, to labeling, identifying and understanding, labeling your market. At the same time, we're teaching our students to do this every year. It's becoming less valid every year, and the reason is that today we are, for a variety of reasons, both cultural and technological, we're each of us much more of an individual, much more unique than was the case in the past. Now, people have always prided themselves on their uniqueness, especially in Western cultures. But the reality is that these cultural changes used to be much more monolithic because we were in a mass broadcasting, mass market kind of world where we might have access to only, let's say, a few TV stations, BBC One and BBC Two or something like that. And obviously today we live in a much more fragmented world where there's all kinds of, interests and brands out there, things that we've never even heard of, activities we've never even heard of. Somebody's looking for a brand in that space. And so we really need to be more proactive about allowing our customers more input in telling us who they are, rather than us telling them who they are. And especially with these kind of broad brush labels like, oh, you're a woman in your late 20s and you live in a metropolitan area, therefore you must be interested in brands A, B, and C. It really doesn't work that way anymore. And so I think it's often more productive to think in terms of so-called markets of one, where each of your customers is potentially a unique market. Now, they're going to share some characteristics, of course, but especially if you're using some kind of a online marketing system, some kind of a marketing database, a CRM, you're already working with markets of one, because to some extent you're hopefully adjusting your message and perhaps even your product or service to the specific needs of an individual, often based on their prior behavior. So rather than just saying you're a member of this large homogeneous group, let's look at what you specifically have done in the past, because we know that none of us can tell the future, with 100% clarity, although some people claim they can. But we know that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So by looking at how the individual is using brands in their life as they go through their life, all the different roles that they have to play, you get a much richer picture of how your brand might fit in with that customer's lived experience.
I think it's really interesting what you're saying about markets of one. And I suppose for me, when I look at working with businesses, I always ask my clients a question. And the first question I ask them is, what's the most unique thing in your business? And they come back with a number of selling points about their product or their service. But going back to your market of one, the only truly unique thing in a business is the squishy thing operating it. So I suppose for me, is marketing outwards from a brand perspective would be, you have to talk about your own uniqueness to find your tribe and find people that have similar traits in the past as you, because they'll resonate the most. Is that something you agree with?
I would agree with that. I think a lot of it goes back to, you can call it semantics, but it goes back to what we mean by a brand when we talk about a brand. And for many marketers, I think they need to understand that the brand is actually more organic and more all-encompassing than they think about. It's not just the selling points. It's not the logo. The brand is essentially a personality. We talk about a brand personality. And I often ask managers when I talk to them, it's kind of a similar question to what you said, but I might say, well, if your brand, if your product or service came to life magically as a person, who would that person be? Describe them to me: young, old, male, female, etc. Some people are able to do that quite readily, but many people really scratch their head and say, well, what do you mean come to life as a person? They can't really wrap their arms around that. And of course, I don't think that's really going to happen, but we do think about these brands as if they were people. And just like people, there's some people we gravitate towards very easily. Others, there's certain people we meet where within 5 seconds, we know that we're probably not going to get along with them very well. The same is true with products. And if you're not adopting that kind of human-centric perspective, then you're selling only based on functionality. And the reality is that you may believe that your product is functionally superior, and perhaps it is, but it's very frustrating when you ask consumers. In many cases, you'll put 4 or 5 leading brands together and you say, which of these is the best? Very often they shrug their shoulders and say, yeah, they're all pretty good. Now, a brand manager doesn't want to hear that, but from the customer's perspective, you need to give them a real reason to differentiate yourself. And it's usually not going to be the functionality, especially in many mature categories where, the reality is all the brands do work fairly well, the major brands. They've been market tested. They're not going to explode when you turn them on. They're going to perform the same basic function. And yet we see in virtually every category that there's 1 or 2 brands that cluster at the top that really dominate the market. And often the reason for that is the story that they're telling. So they've got the same pretty much basic functionality, but their story is what differentiates them. And that's what people are buying.
You mentioned Web 2.0. Obviously, we're moving into an era now of Web 3.0, and marketing is obviously going to change with that. As it always does, it's always evolving. But during the Web 2.0 era, we've seen a dominance of social media advertising, targeting customers, and basically being in their pocket, telling them what they should buy, when they should buy it. I remember reading a report recently from Twitter, and they were saying about how an audience is fed up of seeing the sea of the same, and the audience are getting wiser and wiser to being essentially cookied and then showed something to buy it as a retargeting.
Yeah.
I believe that small businesses are not focusing enough on the brand building element, but focusing on the instant results. And I'd be interested to get your point of view of why do you think that is, that they're avoiding the long-term growth?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And, I think to some extent, there's a little too much emphasis on acquiring that new customer and not enough emphasis on nurturing the customers that you have. So yes, it's good. You always need to be adding new customers, but the problem is what you want to do today is to focus more on what's often called the lifetime value, the customer lifetime value, how much that customer is worth to you over a period of years, of many years, perhaps. And by some estimates, it's about 6 to 7 times more expensive to acquire a new customer than to keep an old one. But a lot of companies are driven, and understandably so, by the desire to see their numbers go up, their number of followers go up, et cetera. But we know that one of the basic principles in marketing is the so-called the so-called 80-20 rule, where roughly 80% of your revenue comes from 20% of your customers as a benchmark. What that implies is that the real value is with that group that is much smaller numerically, but they are much more loyal to you. And so I think we tend to, so to speak, a new business or a small business makes a friend, shakes their hand and then moves on in the party to shake the next hand, rather than learning more about the hand they just shook. And so building engagement is not just about getting people to like you on social media. That just doesn't do it. It builds your numbers, but it doesn't build your engagement, really. True engagement is going to happen when that customer really feels a connection to you, what I call brand resonance, where they feel that your brand is something that is essential to them or very desirable to them in their own project to basically express who they are and to live their lives. So numbers are nice, but passion for your brand, for each of those individuals that you work so hard to get, don't just check the box and move on. Now think about, what can I do to get more value out of that customer? How can I involve them? How can I get their input? Because your best customers are also your best salespeople. They're your best product development people. They are the best asset that you have, and many companies totally overlook that.
Circling back to when you've worked with some of the world's leading brands, and as you mentioned, they're very, very good at this. And obviously you have a wealth of experience in this area. I'm really interested in seeing your opinion on how those smaller businesses could utilize some of the tactics that you've used with bigger brands, and what could a smaller business do to obviously up their communication and strive for that engagement with their customers.
Yeah, a great question. And, a lot of small business people kind of throw up their hands and say, well, there's no way I can compete. I don't have anything near the budget, that a big company would have. and that's true. But on the other hand, a small business has a huge advantage over a big one, especially when changes need to be made, when you need to pivot in your strategy somehow, when you need to be flexible, when you need to allow your brand to morph over time, to allow its meaning to change over time. It's like turning a battleship as compared to turning a small sailboat. You're able to pivot, and that does give you an advantage, because you're in a much better position to truly know your customers to a much greater extent. The big company may be using a CRM, and maybe they're sending me an email on my birthday. But if you're a business that has a direct relationship with a customer, whether it's because they shop your store in your town, or you're aware of them, you're in the same basic area, or they're a niche brand that services a group like you, that's a tremendous advantage, because you're in a position to build a relationship with that customer that the bigger brands can't necessarily do. And it's because of the cynicism that you alluded to. I think a lot of people are saying, well, I'm not sure that Amazon really is my friend. They say they want to be my friend. On the other hand, that small business that I've been buying at for 20 years, they truly are my friends. And we saw this during the lockdown. Like a lot of let's say restaurants and other small businesses that were threatened. If they were well established in a community, in many cases, the local people came to their aid. They actually donated money to them, or they made sure to buy from them, et cetera, because they had created that special relationship. And you didn't see that so much when people were dealing with the big companies.
No, I totally agree there. And building that community and being their friend. I always use the saying, people hate being sold to, but they love shopping with friends. So ultimately is being that person or that brand to, as you say, resonate with their potential customers. So to wrap up, I absolutely love asking this question as it gives my listeners something they may not have heard before. So going back to the start of your career, what would be the one bit of advice you would give to yourself?
That is a very interesting question. I would probably, in retrospect, have paid more attention to the technology side of things. When I started working with companies back in the 80s and 90s, this was before cell phones and all that. I don't think that we realized the extent to which technology was going to reshape, well, our lives and certainly our marketing careers. And the ability, for example, to collect data online, to collect customer data and so on. And by the way, for small businesses to do it very inexpensively has really changed the game. So both in terms of being a social scientist and wanting to do research with people, and being a marketing researcher and wanting to understand more about people's brand preferences, linking into these technologies it is such a powerful tool that we didn't have back in the day. And so I often think, if I were starting today, what would my PhD topic be? And I'm sure it would have something to do with social media, probably how ideals of beauty are changing due to social media, for example. But of course, we didn't see that coming. I wish I had back in, say, 1990.
Michael, thank you again for spending some time with me. And finally, where can the listeners find you online?
I have a website, which is just michaelsolomon.com. And you can also email me just at michael@michaelsolomon.com.